Hi, thank you for joining us on the Odgers-Berndtson One Question series on this hot day. My name is Jules McKean and I run the media practice for Odgers-Berndtson Executive Search out of London. Really happy on the summer series today to be joined by Sarah Scholefield from Grayling. Hi Sarah, thanks for joining us.
Hi there, lovely to be here.
Sarah is the Global Chief Executive of Grayling and she's spent her career in communications. She's worked in both the UK and Asia. Her experience spans representing top corporate entities, leading multinational businesses and global consumer brands. She's worked extensively across brand marketing, crisis and issues management, corporate reputation building and B2B marketing. And Sarah's clients have included some really well-known names like Nike, Jack Daniels, British Airways, M&S, Huawei and eBay. And before she took over the UK business at Grayling, Sarah was the Global Client Relationship Manager for PayPal. She's created global positioning and thought leadership platforms across the world. And she also worked at Fleishman Hillard, Edelman, Freud's and Rudafin. And in her current role, Sarah is responsible for growing the Grayling business globally. She creates and fosters an inclusive and high-achieving working environment. And I'm sure we're going to talk a bit about that today as well. And she evolves effective communication services to solve client problems in, let's be honest, quite a rapidly changing world right now. So Sarah, a lot for us to talk about. So I'm going to fire a question straight at you for us to discuss. What do you think are the key things that our industry is going to be still talking about in 12 months' time?
Well, Jules, first of all, thank you very much for having me. And oh my God, what a big question. I think there are a number of things that we're going to be talking about in 12 months' time, and industry rather than sectors or services specifically. And in fact, I think they're conversations we're already having, but I think realistically, I'm not sure we will have made too many inroads into solving some of the problems we're facing. And I am talking specifically around talent, yes. Which is an enduring conversation, which you will be very familiar with in your role, but an enduring conversation that certainly I think most agency leaders face and seems becoming more and more difficult. And obviously within that, there's also all the issues around accountability, equality, diversity and inclusion. And sadly, you know, I think with all the best efforts that we've been making, particularly in the PR industry, to try and make our sort of workforce more inclusive, more diverse. I think we are seeing a huge amount of sort of initiatives that people are setting up. So I think there's a real appetite for it. Yeah. But I think one of the problems that we face, and I think we will continue to face this time next year, is through all these initiatives, we can get people into our businesses in a way that perhaps we couldn't before. But actually, it's when people are actually within the business itself, what do we do? So how do we retain talent from different and diverse backgrounds, and I mean you know, diversity in all its different forms as well. So not just ethnicity, but also sexuality, you know, neurodiversity, etc., etc. Because I think if you look around, particularly as a female leader, there aren't many female leaders in our industry. I know PR is a very heavily dominated female business, but they tend to all be up to a certain level. And if I look at the other global chief executives, so I suppose my natural peer group, there are very few. There's two or three. So I feel that actually one of the biggest conversations that we will still be having this time next year, and it may have evolved a bit, is really around both a sort of talent shortage, diversity and inclusion, the sort of equality and accountability piece, but also the evolution of what sort of talent is required in the PR industry. Because I think as media evolves, and you know, that's a whole separate conversation we could have, it's become much more visual. And I think historically people that work in communications really focus on the written and the spoken word. And actually, if you look at things now, the way that we communicate is largely through video, it's through photography. So content creators are really critical in PR in a way that they just weren't a few years ago. And I think trying to attract people who are very focused on that level of content and production into PR agencies is very new. And I think the talent pool is quite sort of reticent to do it because they're like, well, hang on a minute, this is not a sort of industry that I'm familiar with and I don't really know how it works. But I think we've all got to catch up in PR agencies specifically and evolve very quickly to meet the demands of our sort of end users who want to see stuff in a visual format. So I think talent evolution and the needs of PR agencies in the industry to attract a different sort of skill set as well.
That's really interesting because presumably all the changes that have been happening in publishing over the last few years, you know, a lot of that kind of those eyeballs have sort of perhaps gone elsewhere onto influencers or other people that you trust. And, you know, kind of thinking about that rise of how Gymshark managed to do it through lots of thousands of just very credible individuals on Instagram and other platforms and on TikTok who might have been representing their brand in a really interesting way. It's so different, but that must be quite hard talent, as you say, to attract. You know, how it presumably there's an awful lot of noise out there, and people like your industry has to really kind of sift through all of that to find the right people.
I think that's right, and I don't think we're a natural home for people who are content producers, particularly visual content producers. I think if they want to go into media, they tend to look at, you know, more traditional things like advertising.
Yes.
But if you're a consumer brand and you want to reach a certain audience, then something like TikTok is absolutely critical. But actually, you know, if you've got a PR person who's used to writing a thought leadership piece, or, you know, not to be rude about any of my peers or colleagues, but it's not a natural skill set we have. And the interesting thing about PR agency staff is we've been mocked for years for basically being sort of jacks of all trade and masters of zero.
Yeah.
And because we do a bit of creativity, we do a bit of account handling, we do a bit of finance, we do a bit of sort of sales, you know, in a way that if you work in an advertising agency, you're probably pigeonholed more. But actually, I think that skill set needs to grow even further for PR people. I think we just need to become much more content producers, and particularly around things like video, around sort of memes, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think, you know, we've certainly set up a studio at Grayling over the last 12 months, but I think it will become part of people's core skills within teams moving forwards, just to make sure that we are obviously being able to communicate in a way and in the channels and on the platforms that our consumers want to find their information from.
Have you found, and this is just my observation, and tell me if this is a load of rubbish, that those of us who have been trained in the rigor of marketing and getting the narrative right and the product market fit, that, you know, landing the message for the audience, maybe that rigor, it's really difficult to try to teach oneself to free it up for brands, or to teach the brands. Do you have to work with clients to say, once you put this information into the hands of the creators, you have to let them engage in the right way with their audiences? And that might be a bit of a mindset shift for us and for our clients.
I totally agree. And I think they need to take more risks, and they need to trust their agency partners, regardless of which agency partner. They need to trust that we know what we're doing. And also that comes back to the diversity point, which is, you know, too often people within marketing or PR agencies are of a type, which means that they only really can communicate to one group of people. And, you know, there's always this you know, big thing about the metropolitan elite, and everybody sits in a London bubble telling people in Leeds how they should, you know, buy soft drinks or whatever it may be. And I think that you've got to have a diverse workforce to reflect the people you're talking to. You know, and I think everybody needs to evolve. And I don't just mean account handlers. I mean people at the top. I mean people in finance. I mean people on reception. You know, everybody needs to understand that the world is a much more sort of broad church than perhaps we've all been working within up until now. And we've all got to, you know, because at the moment it feels to me that sort of D&I sits here as a sort of HR thing, or a compliance thing, or a cultural thing. And then you've got obviously skills and capabilities over here, which becomes more client service thing. They're all part of the same ecosystem. All these things are connected. It's all about us being good at our jobs and servicing our clients to the best of our ability, whilst being a really good ethical employer and giving people proper opportunities. So therefore, all these things sit under that. Yes, you know, they're going to sort of overlap in some places and not others. But I do think we have a huge responsibility to upskill, to understand what we're trying to do for our staff and the people we're trying to reach. But also, part of that is making sure we're recruiting interesting, diverse, and, you know, people that perhaps wouldn't necessarily have thought about PR as a profession previously.
That's very interesting, Sarah. So when you come to, there's one question there about hiring really diversely, but when you actually look at the stickiness, back at your original point, how you kind of, particularly in this new hybrid environment, how you can create a culture where people feel like they really do belong and they really are listened to in this constantly ever-changing world. How do you as a leader go about taking some of those learnings that we've had perhaps in the last sort of 14 months and creating a new world order for how that plays out?
I think, you know, I'm not sure there's a formula to these things, and I'm always nervous of sort of saying I've got some sort of secret sauce that, you know, means that I'm doing it better or differently to anybody else. I think a lot of it is down to the culture that starts at the top, which should be open. And I think it should be transparent in as much that we're all learning, and not just about things like recruitment and diversity, but just generally in work every day, and that everybody feels that within a company that they work for, that they are both valued for the contribution that they bring, but also for the ideas that they have. And I feel very, very strongly that everybody should come to work at Grayling, obviously where I am, knowing that, you know, they can fulfill their potential. I want to create an environment where they absolutely feel that that's possible for them. So, you know, a lot of big agency groups are very structured quite rigidly. And I don't really, I mean, we all have to have a hierarchy and team structure because it's the way that we obviously operate. But I do believe that everybody's opinions are valuable. Everybody has a voice. It is up to the individual to take that initiative and you know, use that opportunity. And if they don't, I can't force people to do that. But I want everybody to feel that they play a role. And I also don't just mean people who are obviously client facing and fee earning. I mean everybody from, you know, the finance team to the HR team or whatever, because they all play a significant part in our success. So I think it is about making sure that people feel valued, not only obviously financially, that helps, but just in terms of creating an environment where people feel that they can be themselves, can make a contribution and really fulfill their own potential.
It's so interesting, isn't it? Because I know you touched on the sort of, you know, the sort of war on talent, as people are starting to call it, for next year. And and certainly we're seeing, you know, the e-commerce talent, digital data talent, engineering, all of that. It's you know, understandably, as so many companies who've done a successful pivot or an expansion or a fast forward on future plans and mergers and acquisitions, is so it just kind of unearthed this, you know, huge need for, you know, absolutely the forefront of digital innovation. Do you find that in what you're doing, and do you also, I don't know if you find this, that there's quite a lot of demand for purpose within individuals in what they're looking to do next, that it's sort of, you know, perhaps this pandemic has made everyone wonder what they do behind their screen and how worthy it is of their time.
I think that's exactly right. And actually, you know, one of the other things that I was thinking about talking in answer to the question about, you know, what might we be talking about in 12 months' time, is around businesses are now more accountable than they've ever been. You know, in a way that they have so many more multiple touch points with so many different stakeholder groups they previously probably didn't have to engage with. So if you're a big business, you probably, you know, previously didn't really engage with your consumers necessarily. But also, most critically, one of those absolutely key audiences is their employees. And employees are now having a voice, and as they should, quite rightly. But they are going to hold businesses to account. And I think businesses have got to go away and look at the way that they plan for crises or issues in a completely different way. You know, as a PR person, there's always been that element of what we do with our clients to say, right, you know, there's a protocol, there's a methodology, what happens if this, you know, there's a cyber breach or whatever. But actually, there's a stage before that sort of crisis preparedness that I think a lot of people will start to look at more forensically in the next 12 months, which is around doing proper deep risk assessments. So as opposed to just going, these are the 5 crises we might, you know, that would obviously, you know, dislodge our business or whatever, they've actually got to say, where are the risks? And it will be in the people they hire, it might be in their supply chain, it might be in their, you know, their compliance. And also, you know, as we've seen many times, it's when they're held to account by their employees for having a purpose that just feels a bit like lip service. You know, and it is absolutely critical that whatever purpose you have as a business, not only is it there to attract talent, but it's absolutely rooted in the DNA of the business, so both operationally and culturally as well. And so I think you're right. I think purpose is really important. I think it's unfortunately becoming slightly overused. But I think it's absolutely the right thing to do. But I think people, big businesses and C-suite of big businesses need to be really well prepared for that and look at the risks forensically in the next sort of 12 months, because otherwise they will be caught short in a social media storm that nobody anticipated, I would imagine.
Because ultimately, presumably, and you'll probably tell me when you were crisis planning for clients, you absolutely also had a pandemic. I don't
never been on a list that I've had to look at, to be honest.
I don't. I just don't know that many business leaders, particularly in service industries, like we're both in the professional services, would have thought in terms of our own crisis planning. In the next few years, the thing that's going to hit us is actually going to have huge impact on the mental health of our employees.
Yeah.
We're going to get to know them both more and less. In terms of we're invited into their houses, there's a psychology behind that proximity, but at the same time, you can't meet anyone in the flesh, and what does that look like? And the whole thing is thrown up in the air in terms of belonging and in terms of identity, isn't it? And I don't, it's sort of not, it's certainly not even your usual crisis, let alone your usual business, is it?
Exactly. And I think it's made people more adaptable, which is a good thing. I think, there's too much sort of rigidity and sort of fixed ways of doing things in the sort of corporate world that I think this is addressing. And people realizing that, by making change, it doesn't dismantle everything. I think there's always this fear that if you make significant change about working practices, for example, that, the whole house of cards will come caving in. And actually it hasn't. People have been productive in the last 2 years. And yes, it's been enormously challenging. And I think certainly my experience is, if you look at people working from home versus the office, there was this sort of huge amount of energy at the beginning, and initiatives here and packages being sent to people's houses and yoga and, all sorts of stuff. And we were all loving it. And there was the summer. And then it got to sort of, I don't know, second, third lockdown, whenever it was in January, and it was cold and it was the winter and it was dark and it was long. And everyone was getting up and sitting at their computers, and nobody was leaving their computers, and productivity just dropped because I think people realize that actually the thing that makes you really productive and obviously develop as an employee is that sort of invisible glue that binds you together as a company, which is about proximity and just sort of learning by osmosis and all that kind of stuff. And I think
clarity of knowing when it was going to end as well. In the first lockdown, we thought we were in it for 8 weeks, and then suddenly it became this drip erosion, didn't it, of trust and of clarity on narratives. But I think yes, and I think it's interesting you've kind of highlighted that sort of glue thing, because it feels like if the core is right of what you're doing as a unit, as a team, as a family, and everyone feels respected and enabled and empowered within that as individuals, but ultimately you all know which direction you're pulling in, which is the leader's job to do.
Yes.
Then that school of fish can pivot and move as often as it needs to around the obstacles, but as long as that core is there and there's no people just straggling, getting bitten off by sharks as you go. A terrible analogy, I know. But.
No, I was thinking it was a rather good analogy, actually, and I think it's exactly right. I think, that's it. You've got to keep the glue, which sounds, I mean, my analogy is useless, but you've kind of got to sort of, to use your words, the stickiness of those sort of invisible bonds that bind a business culturally, especially a business like a PR agency, because we don't make anything. We've got no widgets. We've only got people. So, they are our asset. And, everyone's had such a difficult time. And I think the longer it goes on, the harder it is to maintain that sense of momentum and energy and, and commitment. And I have a huge amount of sympathy for people who have found that difficult, because I think it's entirely natural. But I do think it presents an opportunity to, looking ahead to next year, well, hopefully we won't be talking about the pandemic in 12 months' time. So what we won't be talking about, hopefully, is the pandemic. But what we will be doing is going, what have we learned, and what can we use from what we've learned to everybody's benefit? Because I think there's a huge amount that will be better, actually.
Sarah, that was brilliant. So much food for thought about schools of fish and glue and all sorts. No, absolutely brilliant. And that idea of the core and the binding and focusing on that. Thank you so much for joining us on the Hodges Bernson One Question Summer Series.
Thank you very much for having me.
And speak to you soon. Take care. Thank you.